and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jung-cho. President Biden has invited President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Kishida to a trilateral summit in Washington. Today we discuss how the summit will elevate the trilateral security cooperation to the next level and what that means to the deterrence against China and North Korea.
Spent the last 3 days in G7. This is a critical ally of the United States, and for years our countries have been米国、韓国との連携強化の土台、これをさらに強化する会議になると。
Developing plans for more regularized exercises rather than just exercises in response.
In the studio with me, Dr. Robert Soofer, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Dr. Soofer was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy until 2021. He was also the U.S. representative to the NATO High-Level Group for Nuclear Planning. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having us.
Now, Dr. Soofer, the presidential retreat at Camp David was the venue for many momentous summits. And now that the leaders of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan are meeting there, would there be some breaking announcements on North Korea?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. You know, I don't know about any major announcements. I think we have to be modest in our expectations. But having said that, this is clearly a priority for President Biden. As you can see, he's begun extensive consultations, in fact, reinforcing those consultations in the Nuclear Consultative Group. We've had these interactions with the Japanese as well. So I would imagine that there is going to be some new announcement coming out of the Camp David talks.
Now, Dr. Soofer, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan are facing rising threats from North Korea and China. While Washington has bilateral alliances with South Korea and Japan, if South Korea and Japan were to strengthen security link without U.S. mediating, wouldn't that align with U.S.'s Asia strategy?
Well, in a sense, yes, that if South Korea and Japan were to build up their coordination, their consultation, that would be consistent with U.S. strategy. But look, we're all in this together. And for them to do so without a U.S. role seems both difficult and unnecessary.
Why is it unnecessary?
Well, because in any conflict with North Korea or even China, the United States is going to be involved. So it makes perfect sense that there be a three-way consultation between the three major actors. It wouldn't make sense for Japan and South Korea to do this on their own. But having said that, clearly any cooperation between South Korea and Japan, with or without the United States, is, I think, again, consistent with U.S. interests in the region.
Now, Mr. Klingner, the U.S., South Korea, and Japanese navies conducted joint naval exercises in the past year. Would the U.S. want to regularize combined air, naval, and ground exercises of the three militaries?
I think Washington would like that. And any improvement in not only bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan, but also trilateral military cooperation, if not integration, behooves all three nations. It enables a better response and indeed deterrence against both the North Korean and the Chinese threats. Combined arms would be more effective in having deterrence. But when you bring in the ground component, we know that couldn't happen on the Korean Peninsula given the historic differences and troubles between Seoul and Tokyo. So, but with both Japan and South Korea saying they want to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, we can do multilateral or trilateral exercises away from the Korean Peninsula, even down in Southeast Asia, Australia, etc. And that way you can have the three militaries in part of a larger multilateral context working together, including the ground forces, and those lessons learned from those exercises can be applied for the Korean Peninsula.
Japan has to play a very important rear support role in the case of Korean emergency. Would Japan be able to practice that role if the three countries do combined exercises together?
Well, quite simply, the U.S. cannot defend South Korea without Japan. Not only the access to the 7 bases in Japan designated as UN Command Rear, but we're going to need access and throughput through many more bases than that. Also, Japan would be playing critical roles in anti-submarine warfare, mine clearing, mine detection. So, as Dr. Soofer said, we're in this together.
Dr. Soofer, the White House reportedly is pushing for a joint statement that have South Korea and Japan agree that they have an obligation to discuss with the others in the case of an attack. Is this something that the U.S. wants?
Yes, very much so. Look, again, any conflict, whether it's a Chinese, U.S.-Chinese conflict or a North Korean, South Korean conflict, all three nations are going to be involved. And having said that, we already have in place mechanisms to communicate at the military-to-military level and the political-to-political level. What's lacking here is making sure that all three countries are communicating. There's a process in place and a structure in place for this type of high-level communication.
South Korean government just recently drew a line to this reporting that there is no such discussion. Do you think it's still necessary to have this kind of cooperation trilaterally?
Yes, I believe so. Again, in a major conflict, whether it's a North Korean attack against South Korea or a Chinese conflict, Japan will be involved, without a doubt. And Japan will be consulted by the United States. Whether or not South Korea wants that to happen, it's going to happen. So why not institutionalize this and make sure that there's a process in place where all three nations can talk about this at the same time? I mean, this is what happened during World War II, right? We had consultations between the United States, its UK allies, and others. During war, you want to have as much communication as possible with your allies.
So institutionalizing and codifying South Korean and Japan cooperation in the case of an attack, how does that specifically help with deterring North Korea and China, Mr. Klingner?
Well, I think it's unclear sort of when we talk about codifying it, would that mean that all three nations must consult with each other before they take any kind of military response, even in a tactical situation? So if we set aside that uncertainty, certainly having all three nations consulting with each other is in our benefit. Having it along military channels, diplomatic channels, national security channels. So we need to be doing that. And in fact, I think in the last particularly 2 years, since President Yoon was elected last year, we've seen really sort of a countless number of trilateral meetings at all levels of government amongst the military, diplomatic, and National Security Council representatives. So that's a very positive trend, and it's something we should build on.
Now, if the direction that the three countries are going to consult with each other in the case of an attack, wouldn't that bring about protests from neighboring countries of Japan going beyond the level of the pacifist constitution and exclusive defense strategy that Japan is pursuing?
Well, I think what we've seen is really a sea change in attitude, not only amongst the Japanese public, but the surrounding nations in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when Japan announced in December that it was going to double its defense spending, it was going to implement strike capabilities, in the past, that would have generated huge protests within Japan, and yet both of those had 70 to 80% approval within Japan. Also, there was very little response, except from China and North Korea to Japan's statement of doing that, which would make it a more effective force against not only North Korea but also China. So I think the neighbors, including South Korea, have been much more supportive, or at least not as critical. And certainly President Yoon even said it's very understandable why Japan would take those security steps.
Now, Dr. Soofer, do you think the U.S., South Korea, Japan collective defense and trilateral military alliance is still premature? And as long as Japan and South Korean relations permit, is this something that the United States wants?
I think the objective here is to ultimately deter North Korean attacks, as well as Chinese attacks. The other objective here is to reassure our allies, our South Korean allies and our Japanese allies. If that requires a full-blown trilateral security alliance, then I think we should aspire to that. If we can do this, if we can reassure our allies while deterring our adversaries without a full-blown alliance, then that would be the path ahead.
Mr. Klingner, not having this trilateral alliance, doesn't that constrict what U.S. can do in the region?
Well, I think a formal alliance is not going to happen given the historic differences between South Korea and Japan, but perhaps an alliance with a small a, in that we have greater military cooperation and in some cases integration. So, for example, South Korea has repeatedly rejected requests to integrate its Korea air and missile defense system into the more comprehensive and effective U.S. and Japan system. If it were to do so, it would provide greater security to all three nations and our forces stationed over there. So we need to overcome the historic differences of the last millennium to focus on the current threats, not only from Pyongyang, but also from Beijing. And any effort we can do to institutionalize or regularize that, short of a formal alliance, I think is very commendable.
Dr. Soofer, you are Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy in 2017. And in 2017, President Moon Jae-in committed to 3 no's to China. No more THAAD deployment, no joining U.S.-led missile defense in the region, and no alliance with U.S. and Japan trilaterally. How was this received by U.S. officials at the time, the development? And doesn't that kind of commitment contradicting U.S.-South Korean interest?
Well, in my personal view, I think it does contradict. Look, if our purpose is, again, to deter North Korean attacks against the South, whether it's nuclear missiles or conventional missiles, missile defense plays a big role. These are things like the Patriot weapon system, the THAAD weapon system. These are critical. And they're defensive weapons. They're not offensive weapons, but they're meant to allow South Korea and the United States to protect its forces, its military forces, its bases, and its people while it tries to end the war on favorable terms. So I think missile defense, integration of missile defense capabilities between the United States and South Korea are critical to any attempt to deter North Korean aggression.
Former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said during his time, South Koreans were not treating United States as an ally. Do you think such kind of commitment, the 3-no commitment, is another example of South Korea not treating United States as an ally?
Well, again, my own personal view is those commitments were made for political reasons, for domestic political reasons. And I would look to the actual capabilities that are being deployed in the region, both U.S. THAAD and Patriot capabilities. South Korea has its own Patriot systems. And there's a panoply of conventional forces that we share and exercise together. So no, I don't see it as a weakening of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. Again, I see it more as an issue of domestic political politics.
And you say it's domestic political politics, but it was commitment to China, which is quite geopolitical and quite international.
Yeah, well, that was unfortunate. And I think that South Korea has a huge trading relationship with China. And I think China used the missile defense issue to intimidate South Korea. And they used that same method to strain relations between the U.S. and Japan. And Russia, by the way, does the same thing in NATO Europe. They use missile defense as a way to create fissures between the United States and its allies.
Just to add on to the 3 no's issues, after the Moon administration received quite a lot of criticism, including domestically, after the reports of the 3 no's, they tried backtracking and saying they had not committed to those, that was simply Beijing's interpretation of the meetings, and that they had not agreed to the 3 no's. And certainly more recently, President Yoon has firmly rejected that his administration is not bound by any commitment of the previous administration, which was seen as capitulating to China. So in a way, the 3 no's are now no longer an issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Mr. Klingner, a think tank report said that it has become increasingly clear that the U.S. defense strategy and posture are insolvent. The United States and its allies no longer have a virtual monopoly on the technologies and capabilities that made them so dominant against adversarial forces. Are U.S. efforts reaching out to South Korea and Japan to shore up more military cooperation? Is this an indication that U.S. military superiority has eroded?
Well, the report's basic idea was, we've written checks that we can't cash by ourselves anymore. And that certainly the situation has changed from 1945 when we were the dominant world military power and economic power. Certainly, other nations have risen, to higher levels than they were at that time. Even with the end of the Cold War, we now see China increasing its military capabilities to a degree that is very worrisome, not only to Taiwan, but throughout the region. So the U.S., I think, consistent with longstanding policy, is we don't want to fight wars or deter opponents by ourselves. We need friends and partners and allies throughout the region. And so there's been a recent surge in those efforts, either because of a concern about growing military capabilities by our opponents, but also the realization that other nations who before were not very strong economically or military certainly have much greater capabilities now and can and have vowed to do more for the common good in the Indo-Pacific and also increasingly between the Indo-Pacific and Europe.
And if I could put a finer point, I agree with everything you said, but to put a finer point on it, the Biden national security strategy says that for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States will face two nuclear great powers at the same time. By 2030, 2035, China will be able to match the deployment of U.S. strategic nuclear weapons. It's the advent of having to deter two great powers that is posing the challenge for the United States. And this requires, again, greater reliance on the allies, as Mr. Klingner has mentioned.
So, Mr. Klingner, if future South Korean government do not participate and cooperate with the U.S. alliance system in the region, would the United States be able to easily find a replacement, maybe Australia, maybe New Zealand, maybe India?
Well, South Korea, like Japan and other allies, bring their own unique capabilities to the table. And with South Korea, a small nation which has long punched above its weight, as has been said, militarily, it's played roles in conflicts and peacekeeping operations, throughout Asia and the Middle East and elsewhere. And also economically and diplomatically, Seoul brings a lot to the international forum. So we wouldn't be able to replace Korea, but there's no inclination that South Korea wants to go its own way, particularly under President Yoon. And he instead has made it a basic foundation of his foreign policy to increase and strengthen the relationship as well as the military alliance with the United States.
Dr. Soofer, to encourage more proactive military cooperation from South Korea, do you think the United States need to enhance the level of deterrence commitment to South Korea going beyond the nuclear consultative group?
Thanks. Well, you know that we, both Republican and Democratic administrations, the last two nuclear posture reviews have made it clear our deterrence commitment to South Korea. We have said explicitly that if North Korea were to use nuclear weapons against its allies, U.S. allies, or the United States itself, this would mean the end of the North Korean regime. So we have stated the highest level of nuclear deterrence commitment. We call it extended deterrence. The important thing to understand is that deterrence operates in the mind of the adversary, the North Korean adversary. And they have to calculate whether we have the capabilities and the will to implement those threats. And so now that we obviously, I think we have the nuclear capabilities. The question is, would we have the will and the resolve as the United States becomes increasingly vulnerable to North Korean nuclear threats? And I think that today, the United States is well protected against North Korean nuclear threats. The question is looking into the future, as North Korea continues to expand its nuclear capabilities, will the United States take the steps necessary to stay ahead of that North Korean threat? If we do, now we can convince North Korea that any attack, any nuclear attack against the United States or its allies would be futile because we would defend against it, shoot it down, but it would also be fatal because we would respond in a manner that would end the North Korean regime.
So you said the key question is the United States has to answer that if it can really sacrifice its own city for Seoul.
That has been the question that had to be answered during the Cold War with respect to our NATO European allies. And the way we answered that question was by making sure we had in place the capabilities, the forces that would be available to implement those threats. But having said that, when you're dealing with a country like North Korea, with a leadership that may not necessarily be totally rational, you cannot, I believe, accomplish this deterrent effect with offensive nuclear weapons alone. You need a component of missile defense. Defenses for the U.S. homeland, as well as defenses for South Korea, and in fact, defenses for Japan. This is why missile defense is so important to the overall deterrence framework.
Now, Dr. Soofer, you were the author of the Nuclear Posture Review, and you said deploying nuclear ballistic submarines and strategic bombers may not fully resolve South Korea's fundamental security dilemma. So what alternative do you suggest?
Well, again, the dilemma, as you pointed out, was the risk of North Korean reprisals against U.S. cities should we use nuclear weapons on behalf of South Korea. So part of the concern, I think, by the South Koreans is this potential American vulnerability. The way we address that vulnerability is by building missile defenses, by reducing the risk and the vulnerability to the United States. If we can reduce that risk, then I would suggest that perhaps South Korea would feel more confident in the security assurances that we're providing it.
Mr. Klingner, some South Koreans say that nuclear South Korea will contribute to U.S.'s Asia strategy in deterring North Korea and China. Do you agree?
I don't agree. There are a lot of costs and risks to South Korea if it goes down that path. And indeed, President Yoon has very firmly affirmed successive South Korean administrations' policies that South Korea will not go nuclear. And then we saw that in the summit in April and in the Washington Declaration, where Seoul affirmed that it has full confidence in the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee. So right now we have this nuclear consultative group as well as other initiatives to try to demonstrate to South Korea our not only capabilities but our commitment and to communicate those commitments.
The calls for South Korea to get their own nuclear weapons was actually turned out to be strategically beneficial for South Korea because it led to stronger extended deterrence commitment from the United States.
I think so. And some were saying that President Yoon's misstatements were deliberate as a way of pressuring the U.S. to be more forthcoming. When I met with officials in Seoul in January, there was a consternation as to how reluctant the U.S. had been to be transparent about its nuclear strategy, what we would do in various scenarios, that tabletop exercises usually stop short of nuclear scenarios, use of nuke weapons by either North Korea or the U.S. And then when I met with some of the same officials later this year, it was a very different feel. They said the U.S. was very forthcoming, that they were very complimentary of the U.S. officials. So I think a lot of positive initiative has occurred in the last 6 months.
I would agree with that. Having been involved in these dialogues with the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense, we have over the years shared a lot of our thinking about how we would use nuclear weapons. We have provided them more or less the same level of insight into our nuclear thinking that we provide to our NATO nuclear allies. And having said that, there is a step before you get to South Koreans deploying their own nuclear weapons. It's called nuclear burden sharing or nuclear sharing. In the case of NATO, we actually have alliance members who operate fighter aircraft that are certified to deliver U.S. nuclear bombs. Right? Ultimately, the United States president still controls those bombs, but you have NATO countries that are able to fly and deliver those bombs when necessary. You could do something similar with the South Korean military. That is, train South Korean military pilots, certify their aircraft to be able to deliver nuclear weapons if that became necessary. And that would be a step beyond what we have today, but far short of South Korea owning its own nuclear weapons.
I have so many more follow-up questions, but we'll meet again next time. Mr. Klingner, Dr. Soofer, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.